Good afternoon, thank you all so much for joining the Clear Company webinar on neurodiversity and building confidence in the workplace. It is just midday and we have a good number of attendees who are already online, but I am just going to give it another moment just to see if a few more people join, given that it is only just midday. So whilst I just wait for others to join us, I'll just give you a little bit of an intro about me, so you know who is speaking at the other end. I'm Jenny, I'm one of the directors at the Clear Company. My background is as a HR director, having worked in a number of organisations for most of my career. And I joined the Clear Company a couple of years ago following my passion for diversity and inclusion, and have thoroughly enjoyed working with a broad range of organisations on all aspects of becoming more inclusive. So that's just a little bit about me and who you're speaking to. So I think we'll probably make a start. We've given people an extra minute and people will hopefully join as we go. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that you will find this session really useful. So we're just working out how to move the slides. I'm sorry, we always have a technical hitch when we're running anything remotely. Here we go. There we go, that's the one. Okay, so hopefully as we go through this webinar, you will understand a little bit more about disability confidence. The Clear Company is a disability confident leader, which means that we are able to support organisations with becoming disability confident, of which obviously neurodiversity is one element. We're going to talk about what is neurodiversity and what do we mean by that, so that we have some clarity around what we are talking about. Why embracing neurodiversity is so important, as it brings so many positive things to organisations, and more often than not organisations focus on some of the challenges rather than focusing on the really good stuff that employees with neurodiverse conditions bring into our organisations. And we'll then talk about some of the challenges of being neurodivergent at work and how employers can respond to those challenges to support employees who have slightly different needs in some ways. So that's the plan as we go through the webinar. You are able to ask questions through typing them in, and I will be very happy to respond to those as we go. I'd much prefer that this is an interactive session rather than you just all listening to me the whole time. And then towards the end, we have got a little bit of a quiz, so that you'll be asked to respond to some polls on some core questions that we commonly get around neurodiversity, and then we'll have a little bit of a discussion around those as well. Okay, so why is disability confidence so important? So in the UK, around 11 million people have some form of disability, and that data comes from the Department for Work and Pensions, who track this, and that's 2018 data. So that's a really significant proportion of the workforce and of people in general who have some form of disability. Of those 11 million, it is estimated that around 6 million people have dyslexia. So if we just think about the context of employment and some of the challenges that are presented for people with dyslexia, that is just such a huge number, and one which often gets overlooked in organisations. 2 million people are deaf or have some form of hearing impairment. Hopefully you'll have heard of the purple pound. For anybody who hasn't, the purple pound is a definition that is used around the spending power of people with disabilities. So if you're thinking commercially, an organisation who provides services to the general public, it is estimated that the purple pound is worth around 212 billion, which is an absolutely phenomenal figure. And when you just link that to things like non-accessible retail sites, really difficult to access online services for certain people with diverse conditions and the lack of alternatives for members of the public to engage with those services, it starts to really hit home. There's a massive commercial advantage to this. Slightly outside of disability per se, but around 6.5 million people have caring responsibilities as well as work commitments. So as well as people who have disabilities themselves, you will also have people who are caring for those with disabilities or perhaps ageing parents, and that is a contingent of the workforce that again often is overlooked. Approximately 19% of working age adults are disabled. In our experience working with a broad range of organisations, the majority of organisations that track the number of disabled employees find that the stats come out at somewhere between 1 and 4%, and yet 19% of working age adults are disabled. So I think that just hits home as to how many disabled adults are sat without working opportunities, and what a huge missed opportunity that is for organisations that have a significant challenge around recruiting the right talent. So hopefully that just gives you some information on which to base the discussions around disability in your organisations and explains why being disability confident as an organisation is so important. So we're going to focus now on what is neurodiversity. So neurodiversity refers to the diversity of the human brain, and it encompasses a huge number of individuals. So typically neurodivergent people have one or more of the following and sometimes other conditions. So ADD, as you may well have heard it, so attention deficit disorder, autism, dyslexia and dyspraxia are common neurodiverse conditions. Moving on to the definitions of each of those. So in terms of ADHD, that can display as difficulty with attention and concentration. You will note that as I go through these definitions, all of them will start with can display as, and the reason for that is that every individual is of course unique, and therefore each condition in each individual can present in different ways. So autism can display as social communication difficulties and obsessive behaviours. Dyslexia can display as difficulty with reading, writing, spelling and phonological processing. And dyspraxia is often displays as movement and coordination difficulties, so where there's challenges with balance and poor spatial awareness. Across each of those neurodivergent conditions, other common challenges are around speech and language, which tend to present in all of those conditions, although not for all individuals who have those conditions. Over or undersensitive to sensory stimuli, so that can be things like being in a very noisy environment, being in a very busy environment. Those types of things can be quite challenging for individuals with neurodiverse conditions. And of course, most importantly, they all come with huge number and spectrum of abilities that make everybody unique and everybody a huge talent for our organisations. So why is embracing neurodiversity so important? So it's estimated that 1 in 10 people are neurodivergent in the UK. The statistics around this are slightly more challenging to obtain because we do find typically in the UK and within organisations as well that a lot of people don't talk about their neurodiverse conditions. So you will have lots of people in your organisation who are dyslexic, for example, who perhaps have never actually been diagnosed as being dyslexic or have never talked about being dyslexic, and it is something that they manage. And for those people where it's a relatively minor challenge for them and they worked out strategies to manage it, of course, that's absolutely fine. But for people who find it more challenging and really struggle on a day-to-day basis, the challenges of lack of disclosure do become a real problem for organisations. Up to 6% of people have moderate to severe dyspraxia. So again, those with mild dyspraxia may well not present in any particularly different way. However, those with moderate to severe dyspraxia will typically require more support. Around 10% of children are diagnosed with ADHD, but of those, only about 30% continue into adulthood. But again, that's still a not insignificant number of adults who do have ADHD. And when we just think about that in the context of desk-based roles, for example, then that can be a real challenge for people who are trying to manage that condition. I think this final statistic on this slide is probably the one that is most distressing and the one that we would like organisations to focus on the most, which is that only 16% of adults with autism in the UK are in full-time work. So that's a massive proportion of 84% of adults with autism who've been unable to access full-time work. And that's from research conducted by the National Autistic Society, who are campaigning heavily around this particular area to try and enable organisations to recruit more people with autism and for adults with autism to access work. Pulled out a couple of quotes here that I found particularly interesting around neurodiversity. So in a programme called BBC Employable Me, which is worth looking up if you haven't seen it, because it's an incredibly powerful programme which explains the benefits of bringing people into your workplace. Dr. Doyle, who was a key character in that series, said that what you are missing are people who are going to solve a problem that you've been struggling with for years. And I think lots of organisations would say that over and over again, they go back round problems and they try different solutions and they don't always get to a positive resolution. And yet people with neurodiverse conditions can bring a completely different perspective, which help organisations to actually resolve their problems. The other one is that we need to admit that there is no standard brain, and that came from Thomas Armstrong in The Power of Neurodiversity. And I think we would all agree with that. Everybody has their own unique strengths. Everybody has their own areas in which they're less strong, and therefore it's the same for everybody. But for those with neurodiverse conditions, it's a particularly a particular area of difference. So here's a question. Does your organisation need these skills? So things like analytical thinking. We hear a lot about innovation, creativity, people who are intuitive, complex problem solving, logic and reasoning. All of those are skills that we hear over and over again that organisations need in bucket loads, and yet organisations still struggle. And particularly if you pull out innovation and creativity, we see organisations that talk on a daily basis about how to unlock the innovation and creativity in an organisation. Well, there's one really simple answer to that, and that is to have a more diverse workforce. And those with neurodiverse conditions will bring those types of skills in greater quantity than people who don't have those conditions. So in terms of some more detail around that, some of the neurodiverse skills in the workplace. So in terms of people with dyslexia, ADHD and autism, I'm not going to read through all of these. You'll be glad to know. I'm sure you can all read what's on the screen. But again, it comes with a warning. Not everybody with those conditions will bring all of those skills any more than any of us brings a complete set of perfect skills. But you are more likely to see strength in these areas with these particular conditions than you are without them. And this is based on research that's been done over a number of years across a number of organisations in a global context that demonstrate that people are bringing something quite different with them, which is quite exciting for organisations. So some of the ones to really pull out here, I think, are examples around things like having a technical focus and a photographic memory in certain roles. That would be really very, very well received. So you're thinking about engineering environments, for example, where you need to have that technical focus, but you also need to have those reasoning skills. In terms of ADHD, you will find people who are very solutions focused, so very focused on getting to the end result. So if you need some completer finishers in your team, then that's a great addition to the team, but also incredibly honest and incredibly empathetic typically. So again, bringing those very valued traits into an organisation. People who have autism tend to have great attention to detail. They tend to be very analytical as well, which again, analytical skills are skills that organisations do really value and really struggle to recruit. And particularly in a world where data mining, for example, and data analysis is becoming more important by the day, these skills are skills that organisations are really struggling to find. I would just mention here that an organisation that has done a lot of work around recruiting people with neurodiverse conditions is Microsoft. And if you have a look on the Microsoft website and careers pages, you will see that they have some very specific neurodiversity programs which have been incredibly successful in bringing people into the workplace, and that Microsoft have found that they've had really high levels of performance with those programs. And that they've managed to bring people into the workplace that were otherwise struggling in finding themselves a career. So I think that's one case study that is definitely worth looking at. And SAP is another case study that's definitely worth looking at. Again, they've done a lot of work around looking at how jobs are created and how they are communicated to potential candidates to make it clear that they're not expecting everything from everybody, and that they can bring their strengths into the organisation and really use those strengths in the roles that they need to do. So there's a couple of case studies there that might be useful for you to review. Okay. So moving on to what some of the challenges of being neurodivergent at work are, and at the same time I will talk through the things that we would recommend that employers consider as part of addressing those challenges. So overall, it's really very critical that organisations have an inclusive culture, which I'm sure you're all very well aware of. And in having an inclusive culture, you will then create an environment in which people can be themselves at work. They can be as good as they can be at work and perform in the best way possible. They can then, people can then also be comfortable in disclosing when they do have any disabilities or neurodiverse conditions. And when those conditions are known and can be managed and adjustments can be made, then it just makes people even more engaged and even more productive. So I think always starting with that umbrella of that inclusive culture is really important. And I'm just going to pull out some specific examples of where people with neurodiverse conditions have reported that they have had challenges when trying to access work. So recruitment is a classic example. So if we start, for example, with people who are dyslexic, and the number of organisations that offer online application processes, which of course are very effective and very efficient and work for a lot of people. But it's really very important to have adjustments that can be made to those processes. So some things are a technical solution, so making sure that any careers websites are accessible, which means that people can change the font size, people can change the colour, people can hover over different sections of the web page, and it will read out to them what they need to hear, so that people can access the information in different ways. So thinking about that whole application process is really very important. And then thinking about when people are being assessed for roles, then the type of assessments is really important. There are some adjustments that can be made that are just so simple, such as offering somebody 15 minutes in a quiet space before they go into an interview process. So if you're somebody with a neurodiverse condition who struggles to cope with change, then going to somewhere new, knowing that you're going to go through an interview, which obviously is going to be potentially quite a stressful process for you, just being allowed that 15 minutes to calm down and have a glass of water before going into the actual interview process, rather than being sat in a busy reception area, can make a significant difference to somebody's performance. Thinking about the types of assessments that are used, so things like on-the-spot work samples, written tests, they can be quite challenging, so making adjustments to the assessments that are made. We've also looked significantly into things like group exercises and role plays, which again may absolutely be suitable for somebody with a neurodiverse condition but may not for others, so needs to be very carefully considered and constructed. And it's always very important to have alternatives in place that measure the same skills but make sure that we are not disadvantaging candidates who have neurodiverse conditions. In terms of appraisal systems, performance management systems as they're often known, we typically find that those systems will favour generalists above specialists. So if you've got people who have very technically expert skills, that they will typically not do as well in a performance review, because the criteria that they're being assessed against is much broader than where their area of expertise lies. So where I talked earlier, I touched on job carving as a way of making jobs more accessible to people with neurodiverse conditions. So really looking at the roles and looking at where somebody's strength lies and trying to adapt the roles to those strength areas. That has to then be reflected in the appraisal and performance management system, so that we're not then disadvantaging those individuals by trying to assess them against a broad range of criteria, when actually we've been quite specific that their role is quite technical. So changes in the workplace, obviously we know we live in a world that changes all the time, so it's really important that we can manage change. It would be very unrealistic to say that changes can't happen, but it's about how those changes are managed. And I'd point you towards the quote at the bottom of the slide here, which came, which was put out on social media quite a lot with the hashtag #ActuallyAutistic, which is that it takes me a while to rewire my brain to accept the changes that life brings. So a common misconception is that change can't be managed. Change absolutely can be managed, just those people with neurodiverse conditions might find that it takes them a little bit longer to adapt, and that they might need a little bit more support around those changes. So things like changes in line manager need to be communicated carefully. Changes in standard operating procedures need to be carefully communicated and trained out. Changes in location, again, all of these things. So many times in our careers, I'm sure we turn up and it's like, oh, well, you're moving floors, you're moving desks, you're moving environments, and all of that is absolutely normal business practice to make our organisations work as effectively as possible. But just making sure that people who have got neurodiverse conditions and people who you think might have some challenge with those change are supported and well managed through that. There's a really interesting case that's been going through case law at the moment, which is around hot desking. So an individual, an employee who was autistic, had told their employee about their condition and had then asked not to have to hot desk because they found it really difficult. And they also found it really difficult to be in quite a noisy environment that many people would find quite stimulating, but for this individual was just so sensory overloading for them that they couldn't operate effectively. And this has ended up going through the employment tribunal system and through the courts, and has got to the point now where the courts have agreed that it would have been a reasonable adjustment for that organisation to have found a static desk that was protected from the noise and hustle and bustle of the office for that individual. Now, many of you, I'm sure, would be familiar that case law in the UK takes a very long time to actually feed through to law, but that is actually the position at the moment, is that organisations would be quite reasonably expected to make adjustments for those with neurodiverse conditions. Communications is my final point on here. So there's always an expectation of engaging in communication and social activities that comes with the working environment, which for many, again, is a very positive aspect. It's about making sure that we are thinking about how we communicate with those individuals and making sure that any activities that are organised are suitable for individuals who have neurodiverse conditions, and also accepting that it's okay if people don't want to be pushed into doing something that would be uncomfortable for them. But I think it's always about talking to the individual, understanding what would work for them and seeing where adjustments can be made. in order to include them, but also accepting that if they say that actually that's not something that I would like to take part in, that's okay. So hopefully that just gives you a bit of a steer of some of the things to think about, and also some of the things that organisations can do when you are managing employees who have neurodiverse conditions. So just a little reminder that if you want to send a question through, please do. And I will be very happy to answer anything that I can. And we're going to move through to the quiz bit with some polls. Just bear with us while we get the polls up and running. Okay. So our first poll is: a colleague confides in you that they are dyslexic and struggling with writing reports. So your options there are: suggest that they use spell checker to help them get the spelling right, offer to review their reports and help where possible, send them to HR for advice and ask them what to do, and then ask them what help they need and help them to access it. So please feel free to vote on those polls and we will see what everybody thinks. I'm guessing by the fact that we haven't got any responses come through that we've got a bit of a problem with how the polls are working. So my apologies. Okay. So just while we're trying to sort out the technology, which is not my forte, I'll be totally honest, I will just talk through the answer to that one, appreciating that you may have tried to vote and not been able to, or yeah, we'll see. So I think the quite clear answer, I think, is to speak to your colleague and ask how you can best support them and how you can help them, because ultimately everybody's needs will be quite different. So I think it's always about being taking the time to listen, being open to that conversation and being open to the solutions that will then help people to move forwards. It may be that some of the other things are useful and that actually a spell checker might be helpful. It might be that speaking to HR for some additional support might be helpful. However, that's not always, it won't always be the answer, I guess, is the key point there. Okay, I think we're up and running. We seem to have the next one working, so that's good news. So thank you for your patience. So the next one is: a team member tells you that their daughter has just been diagnosed with autism. So do you respond by saying, "I'm so sorry"? Query it as you thought autism only affected boys. I'm glad to say that nobody's voted for that one. Ask if they'd like to talk about it. Tell them not to worry as everyone's on the spectrum, and say you must be relieved to have a diagnosis. So there's two responses coming through here which are absolutely spot on. So absolutely, again, ask if they would like to talk about it. You can see the common theme coming out through this quiz approach. It's always about the dialogue and asking people what would help. We also have a number of responses saying that you must be relieved to have a diagnosis, and absolutely, that might well be the case. I think the answer to this one again is it depends. Again, some of them are absolutely responsible, are absolutely appropriate responses, sorry. And so if it's somebody that you know well, and somebody that you know has been fighting to get a diagnosis for their daughter, then absolutely you might say you must be relieved to have a diagnosis. If it's somebody that you don't really know any background to it, you probably wouldn't jump to that point. I'm just going to pick on the autism and boys piece. So historically, far more boys have been diagnosed with autism than girls have. And what we're recognising now, autism professionals are recognising, is that actually girls and indeed women often mask autism, and they often mirror what they see others doing, and therefore it's actually making it very challenging to have autism diagnosed in girls. And we're seeing quite a number of adult women now who are actually going through that diagnosis process, recognising that that actually is something that they've struggled with, but they have happened to manage to the best of their abilities. And so therefore it is quite common that people still have that preconception that it's something that affects boys more than girls, whereas actually that is starting to be proven as to be not true. Okay, we'll move on to the next one and hope that we can get the next poll working. Yay, excellent, there we go. So which of these would be considered to be reasonable adjustments? So supporting team meetings to ensure that all voices are heard, reviewing work start time to avoid rush hour travel, allowing extra time in an interview situation, agreeing additional breaks during the working day, or all of the above. Give everyone a chance to vote. Okay, so we're over 90% of people have voted now. So, and 100% of people have got the answer right, which is fabulous, which is all of the above are reasonable adjustments. I will just throw in here that at the Clear Company, we tend to talk about adjustments rather than reasonable adjustments, although the Equality Act does ask for reasonable adjustments to be made. We've yet to encounter an adjustment that's been required that an organisation hasn't been able to accommodate, and there's a real myth around the cost of adjustments, and therefore the reasonable word came in to make sure that organisations were not forced into spending thousands of pounds on adjustments that were not commercially viable. The reality is that more than 95% of adjustments that are needed require no actual financial investment and require a change in the way that we do things. So that's a really important factor to bear in mind. And secondly, where adjustments do require some kind of investment, so it might be that somebody needs a particular screen or some kind of additional support, that the cost of those tend to be relatively low cost, and where there are higher costs, there are support mechanisms out there that can be accessed to support organisations. So well done everyone on that one. And the next one is under the Equality Act 2010, a person who is neurodivergent is considered to have a disability. Do we think that's true, false, or it depends? Just give everybody a chance to vote. Okay, so we've got more of a mix on this one. So it will always depend. So all three answers could be correct. When we look at the definition of whether somebody is considered to have a disability under the Equality Act, it is asking whether somebody has a condition that has a significant impact on their life and their ability to work on a long-term basis. So when we think about neurodiverse conditions, for some people with autism, that would absolutely be correct, and they would definitely be considered to be somebody with a disability under the Act. For other people, where it doesn't have a significant impact on their day-to-day life, then it might not apply. So we have to apply the definitions in the Act rather than looking at a particular diagnosis, because it isn't the diagnosis that makes somebody either disabled or not disabled in the eyes of the Act. It is the impact that it has on their lives. Okay, so just got one more to go and then I'll move to questions. Okay, So how many people will experience mental health problems in a typical year? And while you're just answering this one, I will just talk a little bit about the link between people with neurodiverse conditions and those who also have mental health problems. And there is a significant increase in people with mental health problems with those who have neurodiverse conditions. So although the stats I'm asking for here is more general population, the answer for people with neurodiverse conditions will be higher. So the vast majority of people have voted. The vast majority of people have said 1 in 4, which is the stats that are generally recognised by organisations such as the Time for Change initiative. We've had a few people who've said 1 in 10, which was correct, not, you know, in the not too distant past. However, it has since been updated to say that actually 1 in 4 people will suffer with a mental health problem in any particular 12-month period. So if you think about that again in terms of people with neurodiverse conditions, then that would actually be a higher number. Okay, so we've finished with our little quiz there, and we are now going to respond to some of the questions that have come through. Okay. So we've had a question about whether learning disability falls within the neurodiversity definition. So in terms of a pure definition, typically learning disability is not considered within that grouping. However, it is very common for people who have neurodiverse conditions to also be diagnosed with a learning disability. Looking at the organisation you work for, you'll clearly understand that there are many people who have a learning disability who don't necessarily have something that would be defined as a neurodiverse condition. So I think the two come very closely hand in hand. I think everything that we've talked about today in terms of the challenges that are faced and the adjustments that are required for people in the workplace would be equally applicable to people with learning disability as neurodiversity. And I guess that's why at the Clear Company we talk about the importance of an inclusive culture and not actually trying to tackle, you know, every particular requirement of every particular group of people, because actually ultimately if we respond to people as individuals, then that's how we get the most out of people. Okay. Thank you for your feedback. Do we have any other questions? Am I missing any there? No. Yep, I have. Okay, so I've got a question here, which is, what if you suspect, sorry, that someone has a neurodiverse condition but hasn't declared it? So I think the critical thing around that is to try and create the environment in which somebody feels safe and can share with you you know, they've got the opportunity to share with you if they want to about their own personal circumstances. Obviously, it's entirely up to the individual as to whether they want to do that, and if they don't want to do that, then you know that is up to them. I certainly wouldn't be trying to label somebody. I'm sure we wouldn't, but you know, certainly wouldn't be trying to label some. And it's really dangerous sometimes when people in the in organisations. Unfortunately, is some language that's become more common use around things like oh, well, everyone's on the spectrum, which really, you know, underplays the impact on the challenges that people have who have autism, for example. So I think it's about making sure that we don't label people. That's a bit of your OCD is another one that you can hear quite a lot. And again, for some people, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, is a really debilitating condition, and therefore it should be respected as such. So I think it's a case of manage that individual as an individual, make the adjustments that that individual needs, regardless of whether they've shared with you a diagnosis or not, and then make sure that you've got a really safe environment and inclusive culture. Okay, hope that was helpful. And then there's a question here about where we can get further advice. So a colleague who didn't disclose dyslexia and doesn't really know and don't really know what can do to help us. She's very newly diagnosed. Okay, so obviously the Clear Company are very happy to receive any inquiries and to provide support as is needed. There are obviously all sorts of different types of support. So the Dyslexia Association will also be able to provide a significant amount of support for somebody who has been newly diagnosed. I think another direction to look at is some of the tech options that can support people with dyslexia. So a partner organisation of the Clear Company is called Recite Me, and you may well find that they can provide some really useful insight and some tech solutions that help. So they have solutions, for example, that allow you to basically, when you create a document, it will automatically update that document into a format that is more accessible for that particular individual. So I think there's a number of different things there that you can do in terms of further advice, but please do feel to reach out, enquiries at theclearcompany.co.uk if you require any further assistance. Okay, so that's the end of the webinar and the end of the questions that we have had through today. So once again, thank you so much for joining this webinar. I do hope that you found it useful, and me and the team are here to provide any further support that you might need. Enjoy the rest of your day.